All right, so now we will move to our final paper presented by Dr. Kumar, which is Suspiciously Adorkable Representations of Nerds and Gamers in Popular Culture.
Thank you. So I'll just go ahead and start, and then depending on how much time we have left and if we have any attendees, we can just either just continue to chat or end the session. So jumping right in, 2 years ago, the YouTube channel Pop Culture Detective published a video by the title The Adorkable Misogyny of the Big Bang Theory. Presenting an analysis of the Hollywood nerd stereotype, it almost immediately went viral and generated much debate and discussion on social media platforms. The arguments presented by writer Jonathan McIntosh deftly interwove cultural historiography along with theoretical criticisms of systemic toxic masculinity, starting with representations such as Revenge of the Nerds and culminating in shows such as The Big Bang Theory. The crux of McIntosh's argument is that the atypical masculinity of the Hollywood nerd, often stigmatized and marginalized by conventional patriarchal masculinity, ironically lampshades acknowledgments of bigotry rather than challenging or problematizing their systemic nature. Such an analysis is standard within deconstructive textual readings. However, also foundational to such an approach is the assumption that language use and representationality are complicit in the perpetuation of majoritarian power structures. Such perpetuation is not always intentional, often being structured by the systemic nature of power itself. Whether or not all representationality should be treated with such suspicion continues to be hotly debated. However, it is undeniable that all representations are framed within a context of shared cultural desires and aspirations. Therefore, the question then is not what specific desires within the collective imagination form the adorkable bigotry of the nerd stereotype, or slightly more sinister okay, where did I go? I lost my page. Or in the slightly more sinister light, the ostensibly non-threatening but potentially terrifying figure of the gamer in popular culture. The longest-running television crime police drama in the United States, Law and Order Special Victims Unit, has on multiple occasions come under fire from the gaming community for presenting gamers as disturbed individuals capable of often fantastic acts of violence. I emphasize my use of the word fantastic as oftentimes it is the inability to tell the difference between the real world and their game worlds that leads these characters to commit especially heinous acts of violence. The ludic world in these cases is often represented as a means through which subjects escape either their own experiences of violence and trauma or their traumatizing dissatisfaction with a world in which their difference and marginality are either vilified or not recognized with adequate sympathy. Violence, in a seemingly natural narratorial causation, occurs when subjects are forced to leave the self-actualization of their ludic worlds. Using the pre-existing stereotype of the Hollywood nerd, the mainstreaming of such forms of identitarian atypicalities, this paper seeks to further unpack the representations of the gamer stereotype, especially in contexts of crime shows such as Law and Order SVU. What cultural fantasies fuel in turn and are in turn fueled by such representations? What does the atypical masculinity of the nerd signify when framed within a context of potential criminality? More importantly, do such representations also bring to our continuing cultural misgivings and fears about the internet culture as a whole? These are a few questions that I propose to contemplate in this talk today. At this point, I must proceed by admitting that I'm addressing this topic as somewhat of an outsider. I am a child of the 90s, and to begin with a phrase that we millennials find ourselves using more and more, back in our day, getting on the internet required some level of know-how. So I grew up playing a limited number of computer games, as they used to be called then. By the time online gaming started to gain ground, so did the anxieties and paranoias about the internet as an entity. Once again, I'm speaking of the era of Yahoo chat rooms, where the social media component of the internet was still in its nascency. Besides, internet access was still expensive and therefore limited. I remember visiting the neighborhood cyber cafes in Kolkata, where I grew up, paying anywhere between 20 to 30 rupees by the hour to access the internet. Most games I played followed either the free-to-play or freemium model and ranged in premise from shooting starfighters in outer space to more real-time versions of D&D campaigns. Therefore, growing up and in my early childhood, adventures with MMORPGs, as they are called today, however, were at best limited and sporadic. I attribute this to a various set of factors. Firstly, there was the cost factor. Internet was expensive. To put it in context, 30 rupees in my city around the time I'm talking about the early 2000s could pay for 3 round trips from the northernmost to the southernmost subway terminals of the city. Alternatively, it was also a sufficient amount of money for groceries to feed a family of 3 to 4 one basic meal. One would have been well within one's rights to describe spending 20-30 rupees at cyber cafes regularly as frivolous within the location and context of my upbringing. Secondly, as I said, there was the paranoia, the active paranoia that existed in generations immediately preceding mine regarding the internet. As I stated earlier, getting on the internet in the early years of its existence required some know-how. And the people who seem to have cultivated such facility in navigating the mysteries of the internet were, it would seem, people of a predatory nature. The news media was full of incidents of new modes of cyber criminality. The internet had suddenly become the stomping grounds for psychopaths, sociopaths, pedophiles, and sexual predators. This has been the scenario of many an after-school special on cybercrimes. It usually began with the figure of an older male of perverse sexual persuasions who stalked chat rooms for younger girls or boys to entrap, who would be easily charmed, of course, by the predator's wiles, because not only were they naive, but also starved for attention. They were usually latchkey kids, mostly only children, in an urban and sometimes in suburban settings, who returned from school to an empty home because both parents work, and were driven to the internet for company or companionship because of their isolation and neglect as children in an upper-class urban lifestyle. Such narratives were to leave a lasting impression on my generation. I recall several stories in the news about young boys and girls who had landed themselves in a variety of vulnerable situations because they spent too much time on the internet. One such instance I remember vividly, but it was not one that made it to the news. It was about a boy who was stalked by an older man who had recognized him from a cyber cafe. It was an incident not far from the neighborhood where I grew up. But in that place and time, nobody really wanted to talk, or perhaps they did not know how to talk about the violence on a young boy in his early teens by an older man. Some conjectured that the older man had to have impersonated a younger female in order to entrap this boy first. Others spoke in hushed whispers about how these perverts had found the ideal avenue for preying on young boys. They had gone from groping the occasional schoolboy on public transport to safer covers for their perversions. After all, the chances of physical public bashings were far more limited in operating from behind the anonymity that the internet offered. But not all, but then again, a greater part of such paranoia was directed at gay men, because once again, the lines between pervert, pedophile, predator, and homosexual was still somewhat blurred at that time. Added to such already extant fears surrounding the internet, there was also the growing moral panic around video game violence and addiction, and its socio-cultural impacts, especially on young and impressionable minds. This phenomenon started primarily with arcade games such as Tekken and Mortal Kombat in the early 1990s that were, it was argued, premised in gratuitous and often sexualized violence. The growth of the online video game industry combined the two moral panics. This became evident when attempts were made in tying events such as the 1999 school shooting in Columbine, Colorado, directly to the growing popularity of first-person shooter games such as Doom, Quake, and GoldenEye 007. It is at such a juncture that I locate my reading of 2 episodes from the American crime drama series Law and Order SVU. The first significant engagement with video game violence and addiction in the show was in 2005. The 14th episode of the 6th season of the show presents television's beloved and dedicated detectives, Elliot Stabler and Odafin Tutuola, confronted with a perplexing case involving vehicular assault and violent homicide. The episode opens with an all-too-familiar trope in the early seasons of the show, where our elite squad of detectives are called in to investigate any case involving a scantily clad victim, while of course being jibed at by other police units for being the sex police or the sex crimes unit. After obtaining classified evidence from another undercover detective working for the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the case takes an unexpected turn when Detective Stabler's preteen son, Dickie, points out that the murder his father was investigating exactly matched the MO from a video game that he and his friends play. The game in question is called Intensity, that appears to be loosely based on Grand Theft Auto, that was the subject of much controversy in the early 2000s. In the fictive version of the game, players earn points or currency by running over women in the streets and stealing their possessions. The player also had the added choice to attack and brutalize their victim, with added sexual undertones that allowed the player to rip off their victim's clothing. This knowledge gives new direction to the investigation and leads to the identification of 3 suspects: an older white male, a younger white male, and a younger white female, alongside another older white male game tester associated with the developers of Intensity. The episode also features yet another beloved character, Special Agent Dr. George Huang, a consulting expert in criminal psychology who claims early on in the episode that he could think of over a dozen murders where violent video games were the alleged cause. He points out that the average gamer was most often a Caucasian male between the ages of 10 to 50, and that there was a significant body of research that suggested that while violent video games did not cause rage, they certainly contributed and exacerbated pre-existing and underlying psychopathologies of rage. The episode's story arc also plays on the anxiogenic tropes of the vile, capitalistically minded, callous game developer who touts the only too familiar maxim, "Relax, it's just a game." The writers also capitalize on tropes of the software nerd who does not live up to the standards of conventionally accepted masculine desirability, and therefore lives out both his fantasies and frustrations in a fictive game world. This trope, represented by the older white male game developer, is offset by a slightly less obvious, yet equally toxically masculine trope. The 2 men who are instrumental in the murder are conventionally attractive white men. The older of the 2 seems to be the typical jock stereotype whose dissatisfaction with life seems to stem from having peaked in high school, which he tries to recompense through the recapture of a sense of youthful glory by forging bonds of friendship and camaraderie with younger men. The principal perpetrator in the murder, the younger white man, is written with the intention of being more complex. He does seem to suffer from issues of repressed rage with overtones of sociopathic propensities. There is also indication of an added layer of complexity to his character, in as much as a conventionally attractive young white male in America with deep-seated issues of self-worth can be considered complex in the writer's own imagination. He struggles with apprehensions and comprehensions of rejection, which in the final analysis amount to no more than another familiar trope within socioculturally conditioned masculinity, the toxicity of which relies on erroneous and fallacious conceptions of consent as an intersubjective category. In other words, one might even think of this particular trope as being tied to the cultural growing pains of inhabiting a paradigm shift wherein the simple act of standing outside an intended beloved's bedroom window holding aloft a boombox was no longer a grand romantic gesture, but a potential felony. However, the episode ends on a positive note. Despite every effort made by the defendant's lawyer to frame a defense based on mental incapacity on account of dopamine-fueled addictive behavior catalyzed by excessive gaming, justice does prevail. Our young perpetrator is remanded pending sentencing for homicide in the first degree. The young female defendant in the crime, who is convicted of homicide in the second degree at the end of the episode as well, however, remains a sideshow in the case. Her involvement with the crime and her descent into the fatal addiction being debated in the case boils down to her romantic involvement with the principal perpetrator. The episode ends with a poignantly domestic scene between Detective Stabler and young Dickie, where the father struggles with seeing and recognizing the impacts that violence could potentially have on the developing and impressionable mind of his young son. The narrative comes full circle, or at least concludes in recognizing the feedback loop thematic structure that the writers aim for. Real-world violence fuels violence in the game world, which in turn perpetrates more violence in the real world. This in turn brings home the fact that whatever our position be in an alleged culture war, any form of cultural production operates within what one might call a larger and pervasive desire machine. The second significant engagement with gaming and gamer culture in the SVU universe occurs exactly a decade later in the 14th episode of the 16th season of the show. The episode is titled Intimidation Game. Airing on February 11, 2015, the episode garnered more significant response from the gaming community than our previous example. While the series, as usually required, claims fictionality, a large number of viewers familiar with the gaming world immediately recognize direct parallels between the episode's plot lines and events surrounding the ongoing Gamergate controversy. The term itself has come to describe a series of events coming to light in early 2014 surrounding what appeared to be an organized harassment campaign targeting women in and associated with the video game industry. The most notable of these instances involved two independent women game developers, Zoe Quinn and Brianna Wu, and the feminist media critic Anita Sarkeesian. All three women became the subject of both direct messages and general online posts and discussions threatening their rape and violent acts directed at them both of a sexual and non-sexual nature. It is in the incorporation of such plot lines that the inspiration behind the writing of the episode becomes almost immediately recognizable. The use of words such as feminazis, snowflakes, social justice warriors locates the narrative within a very contemporary discursive space. Unlike my analysis of the previous episode from Season 5, I will not be going into a detailed reading, especially of the more structural elements of emplotment. I will focus instead on more topically relevant moments in the episode's narrativization of events. The story formulaically focuses on resonances between the case at hand and the lives of our team of detectives. Olivia Benson, now sergeant and presiding officer, besides being a single mother to a young boy named Noah, visits her therapist, where she talks about how her son was going from being a sweet and loving toddler to being, quote, such a boy. The therapist, a highly qualified expert in psychology, eerily echoes the old maxim, boys will be boys, stating that the destructive behavior her son was exhibiting was hardwired into the male DNA. The scene then immediately cuts to Detective Tutuola playing a violent FPS game at a video game convention and tournament called Kill or Be Slaughtered, abbreviated as COBS. The principal dramatic plot is introduced with two young white males verbally attacking a female employee at a booth advertising a new game called The Amazonian Warrior. The game is the brainchild of an independent ethnic minority woman game developer by the name Reina Punjabi. The Amazonian Warrior seems to garner the most hatred from COBS fans, who call it a feminazi game that was being promoted by Punjabi's wealthy, white, venture capitalist fiancé. The two younger men later ambush and assault Punjabi's young female employee in the women's bathroom, while a frenzied mob of predominantly white male COBS fans chant the game's slogan, "Kill them." They later brag about the Amazonian warrior bitch, quote, who on an online chat forum, and how they, quote, got her good. They were, of course, immediately traced and booked shortly thereafter. Their arrest by the NYPD exacerbates and gives organization to the hate directed against Punjabi and her game. Things escalate quickly as threats are issued online against Punjabi and her female employees. The magnitude seems absurdly disproportionate to the average viewer. As these gamers now turned cyber terrorists, issue threats of rape, mutilation, and murder on account of Punjabi's game being, quote, derivative and mind-numbing. They also repeat the slogans, "Bitches will die," and "No social justice in gaming." Once again, to an unfamiliar, unsuspecting audience, such escalations seem like an obvious descent into the bizarre. A world of hacking, doxing, attempted swatting, and other forms of violence and harassment enabled by the anonymity offered to these perpetrators by the internet. As with the previous episode, the violence in the virtual world spills into the real world, when a group of angry male gamers organize and successfully kidnap Punjabi, proceeding thereon to release footage of themselves physically and sexually abusing her, while issuing warnings to all female gamers that they too would meet the same fate if they continued to tamper with the male supremacist and masculinist status quo of the gaming world. While the perpetrators are finally apprehended, one of them is shot in the altercation, true to the title of the game, which is presented as having a male cult following, Kill or Be Slaughtered. The episode, however, ends with a sense of unease. Unlike the episode from a decade ago, the audience is not left with the usual sense of reassurance of justice being served. When a battered Reina Punjabi concedes defeat with the statement, "Women in gaming, what was I expecting?" The concluding conversation between Sergeant Benson and Detective Tutuola gives some insight into the moral angle that the writers seek to play out through the episode. Tutuola sums up his own insights as a gamer that are seen developing across the episode, which are a slightly more nuanced articulation of a problematic at the heart of the 2005 episode. Sometimes people lose sight of the difference between the real world and a fictive world that they often choose to inhabit as a means to escape the disaffections of their own lived realities. The implications of such an argument become all the more chilling with reiterations of very problematic normalizations of violent misogynist speech in gaming and online gaming chat forums. One of the perpetrators' mother, who is confronted with the hateful, violent speech her son actively participates in on online forums, where he says things like, "I would like to gouge," quote, "her eyes out," with a rusted spoon. The mother, of course, categorizes this as harmless boy talk, while also seeking to garner sympathies from the interrogating detective by emphasizing that her son's gaming addiction had worsened significantly after his father's untimely death. Now, one is not denying that the show's use of this nerdvana variation of a defense of locker room talk as being harmless, and the representations of cis white het male specimens at their absolute worst, follows a standard crime drama narrative script. However, to completely write it off as having no basis in reality is equally a form of denialism. While it may rightfully be argued that the episode was poorly scripted and is in parts intentionally sensationalist, one cannot deny the outpouring of outcry from within the gaming community by women gamers, LGBTQIA gamers, and gamers of color regarding their mistreatment that the screenwriters themselves employ in this episode as a referential and metadiegetic locus. The writers make references to the cultural trope of male fragility, particularly the seeming backlash stemming from cis-heterosexual white male insecurities and fragilities catalyzed by the conditions of inhabiting a reality that intentionally calls out and undercuts explicit and implicit claims to superiority. The engagement, however, with this trope is far from being nuanced. The perpetrator who gets shot in the altercation between the NYPD and the kidnappers says of Punjabi and other women gamers and game developers that they were trying to take away from him, quote, the only thing he had. This, coupled with Tutuola's reflections on online gaming as a means for living out through fantasy, not as much a desire for a utopia, but rather a world wherein one is rewarded instead of being penalized for acting upon a highly subjective and personal sense of right or wrong, offers a slight departure from the tropes of the 2005 episode. It is no longer just the inability to tell reality from the fictive world that is the problem, but rather the fact that that which is, quote, cancelled in the real world seeks to find a roost in the fictive virtual worlds of online gaming. In the final analysis, it may be argued that the episode merely reinforces patterns of suspicion and anxiety identified earlier in relation to the functionings within the internet and the more sinister aspects of online gaming culture. There is no denying that the birth of the internet was in many ways tied to concerns regarding internal and national security. However, despite being a tool for surveillance, it also quickly became a means to escape surveillance. For the longest time, the dark web had existed as an Ionesco-esque entity that continues to grow and spread invisibly and unbeknownst to the unsuspecting. Increase in relative ease of accessibility over the years has meant that scandals in the online world correspond more closely with the realities of the worlds we more immediately inhabit. Hence, if the worlds we more immediately inhabit are governed by a logic that disproportionately accords supremacist value to, as bell hooks argued way back in the late 1990s, the categories of masculinity, capitalism, cisgenderism, heterosexuality and heteronormativism, pronatalism, nativism, and whiteness in the specific context of a Euro-American centric global view, then why would the imaginative and fictive worlds emerging out of such a reality be otherwise inflected? What is anxiogenic, though not overtly emphasized in such representations within popular culture, is not just the unfamiliar or the sinister, but quite simply alterity. The alterity of marginalized experientialities to the logic of the mainstream, and no doubt the reverse. However, with the reverse, which is the alterity of the mainstream to the marginal, there is an incontrovertible logic of power that cannot be ignored. The recognition of alterity is anxiogenic primarily because of the seeming structural impossibility for intersubjectivity. And to refuse to be moved towards intersubjectivity is one of the many markers of privilege. To refuse to take cognizance or engage with outcries that claim marginalization, oppression, and violation is quite simply to say that one is not affected by the circumstances that cause it. To diminish, vilify, and derealize experientialities of violation is apathy of a whole different order. The question is more one of moral psychology, within which human choice and agency operate. And the choice, as the episode implicitly suggests, does not have to be between killing or being slaughtered. Thank you.